As stated by Médecins Sans Frontières, Gaza has been turned into a mass grave of Palestinians and those coming to their assistance. Since March 2025, Israel has no longer even maintained the pretense of designating so-called humanitarian zones. In the last month alone, it has bombed over 20 times the tents of the displaced in Al-Mawasi, the overcrowded sandy wasteland to which it repeatedly ordered Palestinians to flee, a ground invasion of which is now reportedly imminent. As stated by UNICEF, I quote, "Images of children burning while sheltering in makeshift tents should shake us all to our core." Having denied for 77 years the right of return of refugees and the peremptory right of Palestinians to self-determination, in violation of international law and UN resolutions, Israel is now seeking to destroy Palestinians as a group, including by inflicting on them conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction, by seizing ever more Palestinian territory, and by turning Gaza into an uninhabitable wasteland incapable of sustaining human life. The Israeli attacks on the 23rd of March 2025 on UN personnel and other aid workers in Rafah stands as a stark example. The slide on your screens shows the mangled wreckage of a UN vehicle crushed by Israeli soldiers and hidden in the sand, buried alongside its murdered driver, a UN employee, and 14 medics and first responders, with their destroyed ambulances and fire truck. They were only recovered 6 days later, an initial joint UN mission to recover the bodies having been abandoned after, I quote, "encountering hundreds of civilians fleeing under gunfire." The acting director of OCHA in Gaza described, I quote again, "witnessing a woman shot in the back of the head. When a young man tried to retrieve her, he too was shot."
I now invite Ms. Blinne Ní Ghrálaigh to address the court and continue the presentation of Palestine. You have the floor, Madam.
Mr. President, members of the court, it is an honour as ever to appear before you. It is also an immense privilege, though a weighty responsibility, to represent the state of Palestine in such extreme circumstances for the Palestinian people. I will address Israel's relevant obligations as a United Nations member, focusing on its obligations, 1, to cooperate with the United Nations, 2, to ensure the privileges, immunities and protection of UN staff and property, 3, to ensure the fundamental human rights of the Palestinian people, and 4, to abide by UN resolutions and this court's orders. Israel's violations of those obligations are egregious and ongoing. They are also in breach of Israel's obligation of good faith under the Charter, which is a 5th issue I will address and with which I will conclude. I address those legal issues in the context of the almost unimaginable and yet ever-worsening situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in Gaza. On the 27th of March of this year, the last international staff of the United Nations Relief and Work Agency left Gaza. Given Israel's recently passed anti-UNRWA legislation, no further UNRWA staff is likely to be permitted entry. 3 days earlier, on the 24th of March, the Secretary-General of the United Nations had announced his, I quote, difficult decision to reduce the organisation's footprint in Gaza, even as humanitarian needs soar and the United Nations' concern over the protection of civilians intensifies, end quote. His decision, evocative of previous genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia, followed Israel's breach of the ceasefire agreement on the 18th of March 2025 and its resumption of its siege and large-scale assault on Gaza. As had been threatened by the Israeli Defence Minister, Israel Katz, I quote, "The gates of Gaza closed and the gates of hell reopened." Israel killed almost 500 people, including more than 180 children, in the deadliest 24 hours in Gaza since October 2023. One strike on a designated UN compound killed one international UN official and injured seriously 5 others. The Secretary-General's decision to reduce the United Nations footprint in Gaza followed days later. The United Nations itself cannot keep its staff in Gaza safe from Israel because nowhere and no one is safe. The past 18 months have been the deadliest ever in the history of the United Nations. Of over 418 aid workers killed in Gaza, 295 of them were UN staff. Most of them teachers, doctors, nurses, engineers, operational staff were Palestinian. Those Palestinian staff remain in Gaza. Their own footprint is also being reduced each day as they are injured and killed. As stated by Médecins Sans Frontières, Gaza has been turned into a mass grave of Palestinians and those coming to their assistance, end quote. In the words of the Secretary-General, it is a killing field. Since March 2025, Israel has no longer even maintained the pretense of designating so-called humanitarian zones. In the last month alone, it has bombed over 20 times the tents of the displaced in Al-Mawasi, the overcrowded sandy wasteland to which it repeatedly ordered Palestinians to flee, a ground invasion of which is now reportedly imminent. As stated by UNICEF, I quote, "Images of children burning while sheltering in makeshift tents should shake us all to our core." The warnings of United Nations officials could not be clearer, including by the head of office for OCHA in the occupied Palestinian territory, who himself remains in Gaza. I quote variously, "As humanitarian leaders, we are repeating unequivocally to the world, we are being deliberately blocked from saving lives in Gaza, and so civilians are dying. As humanitarians, we need to emphasize that we cannot accept that Palestinians are dehumanized to the point of being somehow unworthy of survival. What is happening here defies decency, it defies humanity, it defies the law." End quote. Before turning to what that law is in terms of Israel's obligations as a member of the United Nations, it's important to recall the reason for the organization's presence and vital role in Palestine. As recently acknowledged by the Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich, I quote, "For 75% of Gaza's population, it's not their homeland. Do you know what their homeland is? Haifa, Tiberias, Accra, Jaffa. This is a refugee population that has been in Gaza since 1948. End quote. Those refugees, their children and grandchildren, have indeed been in Gaza since 1948, and in East Jerusalem, and in the rest of the West Bank, and violently scattered to the 4 corners of the earth since being forcibly expelled from their homes on the creation of the State of Israel. The mass displacement and dispossessions Palestinians refer to as al-Nakba, the catastrophe. They are the people, alongside those Palestinians previously long and deeply rooted in Gaza, whom Israel is bombing, starving, maiming and killing, and whom it has violently displaced over and over again for 18 long months. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem also, Israel is subjecting to ongoing and intensifying attack that same refugee population, alongside other Palestinians, including those violently displaced previously since Israel's occupation began in 1967. Israel's ongoing mass displacements, its demolitions of homes, entire refugee camps and necessary infrastructure, and its ever-escalating killings of Palestinian men, women and children risk, in the words of the Secretary-General, transforming the West Bank into another Gaza. Having denied for 77 years the right of return of refugees and the peremptory right of Palestinians to self-determination, in violation of international law and UN resolutions. Israel is now seeking to destroy Palestinians as a group, including by inflicting on them conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction, by seizing ever more Palestinian territory, and by turning Gaza into an uninhabitable wasteland incapable of sustaining human life. Having willfully destroyed the ability of the Palestinian people to sustain themselves independently, Israel is now intensifying its weaponization of the food and relief assistance on which it has long forced so many Palestinians to rely for their survival. It is also seeking to destroy UNRWA, the very agency mandated by the United Nations to provide them with life-sustaining aid and assistance, including to, I quote, prevent conditions of starvation and distress among them, end quote, until a just and lasting resolution of their plight, in accordance with international law, including General Assembly Resolution 1943 of 1948. It is against that backdrop that I turn to Israel's breach of its duty to cooperate with the United Nations. Article 2.5 of the Charter stipulates that all members shall give the United Nations every assistance in any action it takes in accordance with the present Charter. This is a broad obligation of cooperation, binding members without restriction as to the nature of the action involved or the identity of the United Nations entity taking it, subject to the action being in accordance with the Charter. This is reflected in state practice, including written statements in these proceedings and numerous UN resolutions concerning Palestine. Israel now argues before this court that the Article 2.5 obligation should be interpreted as restricted to certain limited actions taken by the Security Council, where the United States repeatedly wields its veto to shield Israel from accountability. But Israel interpreted this obligation very differently when being considered for membership in the United Nations. At a meeting of the committee considering its application in 1949, Israel undertook unqualifiedly to, I quote, cooperate with the organs, plural, of the United Nations with all the means at our disposal in the fulfillment of the part of Resolution 194 concerning refugees, end quote. Israel has also interpreted the obligation broadly when commending other states for acting as, quote, loyal members of this organisation, end quote, in providing every assistance to the UN pursuant to Article 2.5. Israel cannot now credibly assert for itself a different interpretation of the Charter. The Court has itself confirmed the nature of the obligation in its Reparation for Injuries advisory opinion. It emphasised the importance of the duty, noting that, I quote, the effective working of the organisation, the accomplishment of its task, and the independence and effectiveness of the work of its agents require that these undertakings should be strictly observed. Accordingly, as the Secretary-General has underscored, it has been a long-standing position of the Secretariat, I quote, that Member States are required to provide every assistance to United Nations entities to ensure the effective implementation of their mandates. He reaffirmed this just 4 months ago in his letter to the Security Council and General Assembly, underscoring that as a member of the United Nations, Israel is required, quote, to give UNRWA every assistance, end quote, in any action taken in accordance with the Charter. Israel is intentionally and egregiously failing to do so. Secondly, and relatedly, Israel is egregiously breaching its obligations to respect the inviolability of UN premises and the immunity of UN premises, property and assets, pursuant to Charter Article 105 and Israel's obligations under the 1946 Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the United Nations. Israel is similarly in egregious breach of its obligations to respect the privileges and immunities of UN officials, including salaried Palestinian staff, international staff, and experts on UN missions, including fact-finding missions. Those obligations are unqualified and apply both in times of peace and of armed conflict. They cannot be abrogated by a military occupier, particularly one that is unlawfully present in occupied territory. Given that those obligations bind Israel pursuant to the Charter and the 1946 Convention to which it is a party, they are entirely unaffected by Israel's announced withdrawal from its bilateral agreement with UNRWA. Israel's violations of those obligations in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, include its forcible entry into UN schools, its seizure and often violent shuttering of UN premises, and its failure to protect them from attack by Israeli civilians. They also include Israel's obstruction or prohibition of the movement of Palestinian UN staff and of the access by international UN staff to the occupied Palestinian territory. In Gaza, Israel's violations of those obligations include its obstruction of UN aid, supplies, goods and equipment into and throughout the territory, and its attacks on UN food stores, distribution facilities and humanitarian convoys. Further violations include Israel's use of UN premises as military bases and its violent, lethal attacks on UN schools, shelters and healthcare facilities, which have been a feature of every large-scale military assault on Gaza since at least 2009. Since October 2023 alone, Israel has attacked more than 310 UN facilities in Gaza, many being struck repeatedly. Israel violates the immunities of UN officials, including by killing, injuring and unlawfully detaining them, and subjecting them to violent interrogation and ill-treatment, including severe beatings, waterboarding, deprivation of food and water, and threats of extreme harm to their families. Such violations against UN staff also constitute serious breaches of Israel's obligations under the 1973 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes against Internationally Protected Persons. For 18 months and long previously, Israel has failed to prevent violent attacks on UN officials or to prosecute those responsible. The Israeli attacks on the 23rd of March 2025 on UN personnel and other aid workers in Rafah stands as a stark example. The slide on your screens shows the mangled wreckage of a UN vehicle, crushed by Israeli soldiers and hidden in the sand, buried alongside its murdered driver, a UN employee, and 14 medics and first responders, with their destroyed ambulances and fire truck. They were only recovered 6 days later, an initial joint UN mission to recover the bodies having been abandoned after, I quote, encountering hundreds of civilians fleeing under gunfire. The acting director of OCHA in Gaza described, I quote again, witnessing a woman shot in the back of the head. When a young man tried to retrieve her, he too was shot, end quote. As a video recording has exposed, the Israeli Army's Golani unit, responsible for the attacks on the 23rd of March, was briefed prior to its deployment to Rafah that, I quote, everyone you encounter is an enemy. If you spot a figure, open fire, eliminate, and move on. It was the recording of the Israeli attacks on the 23rd of March, found on the mobile phone of a slain Palestinian Red Crescent paramedic, that compelled Israel's retraction of its initial attempted justification of the killings. That recording of Refat Radwan's final words also reflects the sacrifice made by so many in Gaza who have given their lives for others. After reciting the Muslim prayers of the dying and knowing his mother's heart would be broken by his death, he called out, "Forgive me, Mother, forgive me. I chose this path to help people. Forgive me." As stated by the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, quote, "The situation in Gaza will haunt us for decades because no one will be able to say we weren't aware. All the information is available. The images are there," end quote. They are being streamed from the phones of the living and the dead. All the information is available also of Israel's long-standing violations of the fundamental human rights of Palestinians, which is a third topic to which I now turn. Israel's actions, including those long predating October 2023, are an egregious violation of Articles 55 and 56 of Chapter 9 of the Charter. Through those articles, Israel, quote, "pledged to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the United Nations to promote higher standards of living and universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all," end quote. The obligations to which Chapter 9 gives rise are not optional. As the United States explained in its submissions in the Southwest Africa case, which concerned another situation of occupation of Namibia by apartheid South Africa, I quote, "In accordance with Chapter 9 of the Charter, states have an obligation to cooperate with the United Nations towards the realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms without discrimination for the people of Namibia," end quote. The same applies without discrimination to the people of Palestine. That is because through the Charter, the people of the United Nations, including Israel, have declared themselves, quote, "determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of nations large and small," end quote. One of the foundational purposes of the United Nations is, I quote, "to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of a humanitarian character and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction," end quote. International law protects and binds all peoples equally. There are no children of a lesser God. Yet for decades, Israel has denied and violated with impunity the fundamental human rights of the Palestinian people in breach of its obligations under the UN Charter and international human rights law, while in parallel preventing attempts by the UN, other organisations and third states to ensure their fulfilment. It has violated the right of Palestinians to development, causing widespread poverty across the occupied Palestinian territory and forcing large numbers of people into dependence on international assistance. And then it has obstructed that international assistance or destroyed it once provided. It has violated the rights of Palestinians to food, to water, to health, to physical integrity, to education, to property, to shelter, and above all else, their right to life, including through the system of racial discrimination and apartheid it has imposed. The hundreds of thousands of Palestinian men, women and children whom it has imprisoned, many without charge or trial, have been particularly severely impacted. Israel's violations have been extensively documented by UN bodies and by Palestinian and international NGOs, and their breaches recorded by this court in 2 previous advisory opinions. However, even as against that standard, Israel's violations since October 2023 have been unprecedented. The International Criminal Court's arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defence Minister Gallant include the crime against humanity of persecution, defined as, I quote, "the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights, contrary to international law, by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity." In addition to the war crime of starvation, dealt with in the previous presentation, warrants have also been issued for the crimes against humanity of murder and inhumane acts, involving killing and the infliction of great physical or mental suffering or serious injury committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. The ICC pretrial chamber considered, for example, that, I quote, by intentionally limiting or preventing medical supplies and medicine from getting into Gaza, the two individuals are responsible for inflicting great suffering by means of inhumane acts on persons in need of treatment. Doctors were forced to operate on wounded persons and carry out amputations, including on children, without anaesthetics, causing these persons extreme pain and suffering, end quote. And almost inconceivably, the situation has deteriorated further since those warrants were issued. As of late 2024, the UN had already assessed that local water and food production in Gaza, crops, olive tree orchards, fishing, cattle and poultry farms had been all but destroyed, as had been essential services, including electricity, water and sewerage, alongside the destruction of bakeries, shops and trade. And now, no fuel, no medicine, no food, no water. Nothing has been permitted by Israel to enter Gaza for 57 days. 3 days ago, on Friday, the UN World Food Programme announced that it had now, I quote, depleted all its food stocks in Gaza. Widespread malnutrition, rampant infectious diseases, alongside untreated conditions and the severe mental impact of Israel's assault on Gaza, together with its systematic destruction of 95% of Gaza's hospitals and maternity clinics, and its killing of so many of Gaza's medical experts, will impact Palestinians for generations. This is not just about Gaza's present, but about its very future. And Gaza's future, its approximately 1 million children, are being impacted particularly severely. Children are literally freezing and starving to death. They include 79 children, including 8 newborn babies, who died during the particularly harsh cold weather of Christmas and New Year gone by. Gaza is now home to the largest cohort of child amputees in the world, the largest orphan crisis in modern history, and a whole generation in danger of suffering from stunting, causing irreparable physical and cognitive impairments. Over 15,600 children have been killed violently. Tens of thousands more of Gaza's children are injured or missing, and many of those surviving are so traumatized that they openly express the wish to die. They, like everyone in Gaza, are in desperate, urgent need of assistance, which Israel continues to block. As recently warned by the heads of 12 international aid agencies, I quote, survival itself is now slipping out of reach. Israel's acts are not just murderous and inhumane, they are genocidal, as the UN Commission of Inquiry and others have concluded, and as is the near consensus view across the human rights community. While the determination of Israel's international responsibility for genocide is the subject of other proceedings before this court, the risk to the right of Palestinians to be protected from acts of genocide is at issue in these proceedings. That is because the court is being asked to advise on Israel's obligations in relation to the provision of aid and other services to Gaza in the context of a binding determination by a competent organ of the United Nations, being the court itself, that there exists a real and imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to the right of Palestinians to be protected from acts of genocide, and that Israel must ensure humanitarian aid and basic services in that situation. Despite Israel's objections, there is nothing to prevent the court advising on the obligations flowing from that situation in these proceedings. On the contrary, given that what is an issue is at the very least a situation of a risk of a violation of a peremptory norm of an erga omnes nature, the court could itself risk, I quote, failing in the discharge of its judicial functions if it did not declare that there is an obligation especially upon members of the United Nations, to bring that situation to an end," end quote, as the court underscored in the South West Africa case. In the context of what UNRWA's Commissioner General has called, I quote, "one of the darkest times for our common humanity that we vowed would not happen again," end quote, the court might well consider it particularly important to remind all states again, as it did a year ago in Nicaragua versus Germany, of their international obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, as well as under other binding rules of international law. That brings me to the fourth and penultimate issue: Israel's violations of UN resolutions and the orders of this court. Applying the court's reasoning in South West Africa, there is no doubt that the 4 Security Council resolutions addressing the current situation in Gaza are binding decisions pursuant to Article 25 of the Charter, having regard to their subject matter, their imperative language, and the discussions leading to them. Those discussions include the Secretary-General's exceptional triggering in December 2023 of Article 99 of the Charter, the most powerful tool available to him, permitting him to bring to the Security Council, quote, "any matter which, in his opinion, may threaten the maintenance of international peace and security," end quote. Israel's continuing failure to comply with those resolutions, with unanimous Resolution 2417, which condemns the unlawful denial of humanitarian access to civilian populations, and with dozens of other Security Council resolutions since its admission to the United Nations, constitute repeated violations of Charter Article 25, reflecting a fundamental rejection of the Security Council's authority. Israel has similarly defied numerous General Assembly resolutions, including those calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, setting out the modalities for the implementation of this Court's 2024 advisory opinion, and, I quote, "strongly deploring the continued and total disregard and breaches by the Government of Israel of its obligations under the Charter." End quote. Israel continues to defy Resolution 194 concerning the right of return of Palestinian refugees, with which it unequivocally undertook to comply on being admitted to UN membership, and Resolution ES 1024, demanding that Palestinians displaced during Israel's occupation be allowed to return home, as stipulated by this court in its 2024 opinion. Israel has also repeatedly violated Charter Article 94(1) by failing to comply with this court's binding orders in South Africa versus Israel. Israel's Prime Minister has rejected the court's authority, asserting that, I quote, "nobody will stop us, not The Hague, not the axis of evil, and not anybody else." Just 12 days ago, its Defence Minister declared, in defiance of this court's orders, that, I quote, "Israel's policy is clear, and no humanitarian aid is about to enter Gaza." In violation of the court's order to maintain open land crossing points, in particular the Rafah crossing, previously described by the UN High Commissioner as, quote, "the symbolic lifeline for 2.3 million people in Gaza," Israel has closed all crossings, and it has turned Rafah itself, once a refuge for almost 1.5 million displaced Palestinians, into a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The slide on your screens, reflective of the general tenor of Israeli media since at least October 2023, shows Rafah devastated, with the caption, "The annihilation of Rafah is complete," alongside an Israeli flag and a flexed bicep. Plans are reportedly underway for Israel to annex 75 square kilometres of Rafah, 1/5 of Gaza, to Israel's so-called buffer zone, permanently. This, together with Israel's continuing maritime blockade, cuts Gaza and its people off from direct aid and assistance and from the rest of the world. In further violation of the court's orders, Israel continues to block UN-mandated investigatory bodies from Gaza, while destroying and burying evidence of its crimes. Despite the extraordinary efforts of Palestinian journalists, who are themselves repeatedly targeted and killed, so much remains undocumented. As stated by UNRWA's Commissioner General, I quote, "I shudder to think of what will still be revealed about the horrors that have taken place in this narrow strip of land." Simultaneously, Israel obstructs external investigations. It does so while its officials denounce the UN Commission of Inquiry and the UN Human Rights Council itself as, quote, "a propaganda mouthpiece for terrorist organisations and anti-Semitic Israel haters engaged in blood libels," and calls for the Council to be, quote, "removed from this earth." And so to my final submission concerning the principle of good faith, one of the United Nations bedrock principles set out in Article 2.2 of the Charter. It provides, "All members, in order to ensure to all of them the rights and benefits resulting from membership, shall fulfil in good faith the obligations assumed by them in accordance with the present Charter." The obligation, reaffirmed in the Declaration on Friendly Relations, was described by the Court in the nuclear test case as, quote, "one of the basic principles governing the creation and performance of legal obligations, whatever their source," end quote. It reflects not only the maxim of pacta sunt servanda, but also that of qui habet commode, fere debet honora. Whomever receives the advantages must also bear the responsibilities. Israel is failing to fulfill its Charter responsibilities in good faith. Its violations of the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people, its attacks on the United Nations and on UN officials' property and premises, its deliberate obstruction of the organisation's work, and its attempt to destroy an entire UN subsidiary organ are unprecedented in the history of the organisation. They evidence a fundamental repudiation by Israel of its Charter obligations, owed both to the organisation and to all UN members, and of the international rule of law. They are antithetical to the actions of a peace-loving state. Israel's very submissions to this court violate its obligations to cooperate with the UN in good faith, advancing allegations for which Israel has persistently failed to provide credible evidence. This is notwithstanding the Secretary-General's call on Israel, quote, "to refrain from such misrepresentations," end quote, given how very damaging they are to the United Nations. But for Israeli officials, damage to the United Nations appears to be the point. Their attacks are not limited to UNRWA or indeed the UN Human Rights Council. Israel has declared the Secretary-General of the United Nations himself persona non grata in Israel, accusing him of being, quote, "an official Hamas spokesperson engaged in anti-Semitic and anti-Israel conduct." Israeli officials demand his resignation, labelling his triggering of Charter Article 99 and his calls for a ceasefire in Gaza, quote, "a danger to world peace." Senior Israeli officials level similar accusations at the United Nations itself as an organisation, denouncing it as, quote, "a swamp of anti-Semitic bile, an accomplice to terrorists, and a stain on humanity." Israeli officials have even sought to discredit this court, calling it, quote, "an anti-Semitic court comprising judges from Muslim dictatorships, which has been manipulated and weaponized in the persecution of the Jewish people." As stated by UNRWA's Commissioner General, I quote, "the international order is crumbling in a repetition of the horrors that led to the establishment of the United Nations and in violation of commitments to prevent their recurrence. The attacks on UNRWA are an integral part of this disintegration," end quote. Not stopping at UNRWA, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations itself has demanded that the entire UN and, quote, its corrupt courts, the ICC and the ICJ, must be defunded, end quote. In addition to seeking to destroy the protective application of international law to the Palestinian people, Israel appears set on destroying the very international framework created to ensure compliance with international law and accountability for its breach, with profound consequences that reverberate far beyond Palestine and Palestinians. If these venerable institutions are to survive, and if, in the words of the UN Relief Chief, quote, the basic principles of law still count, the international community must act while it can to uphold them, end quote. Mr. President, members of the Court, the international community is so acting in seeking the Court's advice on these matters, having regard to the Court's prior vital, unwavering reaffirmation of international law in its 2024 advisory opinion. Mindful of the former Secretary-General's description of the United Nations as, quote, the hope and home of all humankind, with the Charter at its compass, end quote, the State of Palestine respectfully calls on this Court to provide this further advisory opinion urgently to reset that compass in the continuing desperate hope that international law might finally prevail. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges.
Mr. President, members of the Court, I thank you for your kind attention and I ask you to now call Professor Imses.